It's time for Herd Mentality, the weekly episode where you control the discussion today on Locked On Bills.
You are Locked On Bills, your daily Buffalo Bills podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, Bills Mafia? It's Joe Marino, author of Go Bills and Buffalo's Run, also the co-host of the Locked On NFL Scouting Podcast, and I'm your host of Locked On Bills. Want to thank you for making Locked On Bills your first listen every day, and a big welcome and shout out to our everydayers. You know who you are. Those of you who never miss a single episode, I appreciate y'all being here very, very much. I'd also like to invite you to subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers can get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 if your bet wins. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. Well, folks, welcome in. We are going to do a couple of different things here today. I want to have a couple of segments of Herd Mentality. That'll be blocks 2 and 3 today. And then in our opening segment, I want to talk about the Bills releasing Nyheim Hines and some of the buzz coming out of the NFL Scouting Combine, in particular about the wide receivers, a position of need for the Buffalo Bills, a lot of interest there. And I've gotten a lot of questions about different prospects and how I'm interpreting the Combine. And so I'll share some of those thoughts with you here today. But let's start with Nyheim Hines, Bills running back. Adam Schefter reporting that the Bills are preparing to release Nyheim Hines, and that move will clear $4.6 million in cap space. And so we know the Bills are over the salary cap. They received some relief when the NFL announced that the salary cap would be $255.4 million, which was much higher than what the projections were. Then they restructured the contract of Connor McGovern and have now released Nyheim Hines. There's more moves to come. They're definitely going to restructure Josh Allen's contract, maybe some other restructures, maybe some players released. But so far, we get the restructure of Connor McGovern and the release of Nyheim Hines. Obviously, a very unfortunate sequence of events with Nyheim Hines. The Bills traded for him, gave up Zach Moss and I think a 5th-round pick to get Nyheim Hines. Has a pretty quiet stretch as he's onboarded in the middle of the season to the Buffalo Bills, particularly on the offensive side of the football. Did a good job as a punt returner and a kick returner, of course. In that first game after the Damar Hamlin incident, Nyheim Hines takes that opening kick for a touchdown against the New England Patriots and then adds another kick return for a touchdown in that game. But we never really saw him take off offensively. Has the jet ski incident last summer that sidelines him for all of 2023 due to an ACL injury, and now he's released. And I don't know if this completely shuts the door on Nyheim Hines coming back to the Bills, maybe, later in the offseason as he's healthy and maybe there's not as much of a market, he could come back. But obviously this is a path forward that probably doesn't include Nyheim Hines. So James Cook, you're pretty much your only running back right now under contract. So things might look a lot different around James Cook. Not that Nyheim Hines was really part of the mix in 2023, but we finally have some indication as to whether or not he's going to be part of the mix next year or not. I do think that this could mean a good thing for Deontay Hardy and his status with the team in 2024. I will note, and I feel like maybe there's some confusion out there, but Deontay Hardy is under contract for 2024. Now, there's some flexibility there. Brandon Beane could release Deontay Hardy and save $4.2 million in 2024 cap with 1.4 dead cap accumulation. Now, Hardy is due a $500,000 roster bonus on March 18th. So I think you'll know before March 18th if Deontay Hardy is going to be part of the plans for the Buffalo Bills. But as a guy that can come in and be your primary punt returner, can potentially be your wide receiver 4, I don't think that's not necessarily a bad thing. I know Deontay Hardy wasn't necessarily a big-time impact player for the Bills, but I do think that that turf toe injury that he suffered in 2022 was definitely a factor. He'll be further removed from that. Plus, I think having a season with Josh Allen and, with Joe Brady to establish some level of time on task and chemistry would help him in a second season with the Bills, as opposed to maybe some of the outside options coming in, right? I think it could provide some stability. So we'll see. I know that in talking with a lot of you guys on the subtext, some of you weren't very fond of the idea of Nyheim Hines, of Deontay Hardy being back. But I think as a punt returner / wide receiver 4 on a pay cut, I think that would make a lot of sense to me. But we'll see how it all plays out. All right, let's talk about these wide receivers. The combine happened this past weekend. The testing and a lot of buzz coming out of the combine as it relates to these wide receivers. And the Bills obviously have plenty of interest in these wide receivers based on the reported formal interviews. And these guys showed out. And I know that there's a lot of attention on this need for the Bills. I totally get it. I want to see the Bills add some young receivers in this draft, and perhaps even at number 28 overall, should that make sense. But let's kind of give you some high-level thoughts on the wide receiver class, the combine of the Buffalo Bills. I think, first of all, the top 3 are all top 10 picks. Marvin Harrison Jr. from Ohio State, Malik Nabers from LSU, Rome Odunze, the wide receiver from Washington. I fully expect all of those players to be picked in the top 10. And some of that will be dictated by which teams go quarterback, which teams go offensive line. But I think you're going to see those 3 wide receivers go in the top 10. And so, therefore, kind of out of the range for the Buffalo Bills, although all 3 of them or any 3 of them would be a very, very good addition to the Bills. I don't expect the Bills to trade into the top 10 to try and acquire one of those players. Then the conversation shifts to, well, who's wide receiver 4 and when do they go? I think Brian Thomas Jr., the wide receiver from LSU, is probably that 4th guy off the board. Big, explosive guy, ran in the 4.3s, monster season of production at LSU this past year. I think he's a player that has some limitations. I think he has a lot to prove in terms of route running. But the down the field ability, some of the ball skills, the size, the athleticism, I think he's the 4th receiver off the board. And I don't necessarily think he's a very complete prospect, but for what I think the Bills need, he would make a lot of sense. I just don't feel like with him being the 4th guy and those top 3 going in the top 10 in terms of my expectations, I don't think he gets all the way to 28. I think there's too many landmines along the way where he gets drafted. So we'll talk about Brian Thomas, but I still think he's going to be picked well before the Bills are on the board. Now, in terms of players I come out of this combine most excited about at wide receiver, it's Ladd McConkey from Georgia, who had a great combine, tested, ran well, looked very good in the drills. His gauntlet drill was unbelievable. And you go back and watch him at Georgia, and you realize just how good of a route runner he is, how good of hands, body control, can play on the outside, right? This is not a player that's a slot only by any means. And I think his kind of do everything ability is very attractive to me in terms of an option at pick 28. Another player I'll mention is Troy Franklin, the Oregon wide receiver, came in tall and lean, and his official measurements were 6'2", 176 pounds. If you're part of our subtext community and you're in our Discord channel, I shared in there a few weeks ago. I reached out to a couple of sources on what his size was, and one told me 6'2", 178. One told me 6'2", 180. And so he comes in at 6'2", 176. And so I know that he was listed a lot better than that. But if you looked at his body composition, and I had a few sources that told me he wasn't what they were listing him at. And, I feel like maybe my disappointment level in the size, I've already dealt with that because I knew he was small. But I think for some people that might be new. He ran 4.41, very modest agility numbers as well, which is kind of disappointing. I know that the hands didn't showcase themselves well in drills. So I feel like as a guy that maybe going into the combine had some hype for people as the Bills pick at 28, I feel like maybe he's fallen out of favor. I don't know. The tape's the tape. Good route runner. I thought he had much better hands on tape. He's just tall and lean, and anything physical required out of him is just not going to go well. So it's a good thing he could create space for himself. I don't know. I think 28 probably feels a little bit rich just based on where the hype is, but he's definitely a player I wanted to mention here. I'll get into a few more here. Keon Coleman, the wide receiver out of Florida State, 6'3", 213 pounds, ran a 4.61 40-yard dash, but did have some very good jumps, 38-inch vertical jump, 10'7" broad jump. He didn't do any of the agility tests, which doesn't surprise me because I feel like those would have been very concerning numbers in terms of that change of direction, 3-cone, short shuttle drills. And so for Keon Coleman, obviously he ran slow. I didn't think he'd run particularly fast. My concerns with Keon Coleman aren't necessarily play speed. It is play speed, but it's the route running, right? I just don't think he's a good route runner. I don't think he can separate from man coverage. All the metrics suggest that he struggles to create separation. And for a guy that's 6'3", 213 pounds and is billed as this contested catch specialist, I mean, he only won 33% of them this past year at Florida State, which is not a very good win rate. So I think Keon Coleman could be, if some team is looking for a power forward slot, go get yourself Keon Coleman. I just don't feel like he's necessarily the skill set that the Bills need, and I don't think he's the type of skill set that has ever meshed well with Josh Allen. Josh Allen doesn't like to throw 50-50 balls down the field. He doesn't like to throw into those tight, contested leverage battle situations. He likes to throw to open guys, right? He's more of a visual thrower. And so I just don't feel like Keon Coleman has the skill set for Josh Allen or the skill set for the Bills offense that makes a lot of sense to me. Again, I know his gauntlet drill was awesome. I don't know. I don't see a separator on tape. Xavier Worthy out of Texas, 5'11", 165 pounds, ran 4.21. That's an NFL record. Nobody's ever run a faster 40-yard dash than that. And, of course, he jumped well, 41-inch vertical jump, 10-foot, 11-inch broad jump. He's explosive, right? He's tiny. You can fit him in your pocket at 165 pounds, but he's really explosive, and that certainly gets a lot of people's attention, especially for the Bills, who need explosive plays, right? I need to do more work on Xavier Worthy, so I need to study more of his tape. But I will say this, there isn't a correlation at all between elite 40-yard dash times and NFL wide receiver production. There's no correlation whatsoever. In fact, I think you'd be more disappointed than not if you looked at the fastest 40 times ever for wide receivers at the combine and you saw the careers that they had. It's not very good. That's because it comes down to route running. And speed is important, right? You want to be able to win foot races or run past people. Like that matters. But controlled speed, deceptiveness as a route runner, that stuff is most important. Ball skills, those are important things. And so I want to get more familiar with Xavier Worthy's game before I really comment too much on him. But the NFL someone's going to fall in love with 4.2, right? Like that's just what happens. John Ross, a very incomplete wide receiver prospect, goes in the top 10 despite injuries because he ran 4.22. So we'll see what happens with Worthy. Maybe he's a candidate for the Bills at 28, maybe not. But I want to get more familiar with his skill set. Adonai Mitchell, the wide receiver from Georgia, he ran great. I need to watch his tape. He's going to be the number one priority when I get back to the tape for my next player that I study coming out of the combine. Adonai Mitchell out of Georgia will be that first guy. And then I'll shout out Roman Wilson out of Michigan. He's a player that looks really strong to me. I think the Tyler Lockett comps make a lot of sense, and a player that is very attractive in terms of that skill set, in my opinion. But we'll study him more and have more to comment as well. But we'll have way more to comment on the draft and these wide receivers. I just wanted to share some initial thoughts coming out of the combine because it's such a hot topic. So many people have asked me questions about how I'm processing all this information. And so I wanted to share some thoughts with you here today on the podcast. All right, a couple segments of herd mentality coming your way here in just a moment, including some comments on the pass rush, the cap situation, what needs the Bills can fill in the draft versus free agency. Stick with us. We got a lot to get to. Get buckets with your first bet on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because right now new customers can get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 if your bet wins. Bet on all your favorite NBA players and teams with quick bets, live same-game parlays, exclusive props, and more. Just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and shoot your shot. FanDuel, official sportsbook partner of the NBA. All right, folks, let's get into the herd mentality stuff here. The first one comes from Bills WZA, who says, please talk me off the ledge here. I don't see a path for our pass rush to be any better next season. It would be a miracle for Von Miller to return to elite form. It seems unlikely that Leonard Floyd is back, and most of the free agent edge defenders you mentioned are not as good as him. Even if we drafted someone high, it's unlikely that they will make a big impact in year one. Based on this, I'm convinced that pass rush will be a fatal flaw for the Bills in 2024. Listen, I think your concern is legit. Very, very legit. Something that I worry about quite a bit. I worry about it more than I do the wide receivers. I'll be honest with you. I think the Bills need help at wide receiver. They should add at wide receiver. They should add in a meaningful way at wide receiver. But boy, this defensive line, this pass rush is something that looks like it could be a problem. Now, here's what I will say. Let's let it play out. Brandon Beane has until September to have this roster set. And so right now it doesn't look good, but you just don't know what can happen along the way that will make you change that, especially as we are still almost 2 weeks from free agency, right? Like there's so much that needs to happen. We are in the infancy stages of the offseason. So let's let it play out and see how it comes together. But I think the concern is very valid right now. You mentioned that it would be a miracle. It would need to be a miracle for Von Miller to return to form. I tend to agree that we need to get our expectations in the right place for Von Miller, but he is kind of the key to this whole conversation. That's your lottery ticket. That's your path. Like Von Miller being something close to Von Miller would be so huge for this team next year. So I think you start there. I think you look at Greg Rousseau as a guy that's still young and developing and ascending. And if he can take an Ed Oliver type jump, right? If what Ed Oliver has did this past season compared to previous years, if Greg Rousseau can do that and Ed Oliver maintains that high level, that would be huge. You're hopeful that the scheme can win a little bit more. That with some of your influences that you brought in, you got a guy that was a pass rush specialist coach. You got a guy that is very adept at simulated pressure. So maybe your scheme can help you win a little bit more. But yeah, the Bills are going to have to be right about some bargain bin options here along the defensive line and maybe find some early impact from some draft picks to really get this pass rush going. It's going to be tough. Yeah, I fully acknowledge it. It's a premium item. It's a premium concern. And I'm very curious to see what Brandon Beane has up his sleeves. We know that he's going to invest in the defensive line. He always does. But the path to being better, it might be a little bit tough. Chuck says, do you think of Dorian Williams and he makes a decent jump? He could be a full-time linebacker / safety filling the Poyer role while moving Poyer to the Hyde role. Just curious on your thoughts. I've gotten this question quite a bit about Dorian Williams becoming this hybrid linebacker safety player. I'll say this. The Poyer role last year is a role that existed out of necessity, not one that I think the Bills want to have regularly on their team. I think you don't necessarily want to pull a safety and make him a linebacker on long and late downs. I think you like to just have your two matchup linebackers and your two regular safeties. So I think that whole situation came out of necessity more than that's how you want to structurally be defensively. Generally speaking, I don't like this idea for Dorian Williams. I think that Dorian Williams is a bit of a see ball, get ball type player. I thought his processing and coverage in particular was his biggest problem last year. And so I think playing him in deeper alignments and giving him more real estate is not the path to unlocking more from Dorian Williams. So athletically, I think it's fun that we're even having these types of conversations. But I think Dorian Williams is a second-level player that hopefully can find himself in a position where the game slows down for him and he can process better because, boy, is he fast and physical. I like his mindset, but he's got to get the mental side of the game down. And I think this type of added responsibility just complicates what's already on his plate and doesn't position him well to be in that spot where the game does slow down for him. Josh says, when looking at our current roster needs this offseason, which do you feel makes most sense to address in free agency and which with our plethora of draft picks? So I look at these primary needs for the Bills as wide receiver, defensive line, and safety. And I like this question because it puts you in this spot where you have to ask yourself, where are you most comfortable relying on rookies? And we've all been observing this team over the years, and you can just see that there's different spots where the young players make an impact quicker, and there's some spots where it takes them some time. And with kind of the need for some immediate answers, I think it's important to look at it through this lens. So I like this question, Josh. To me, the spot that I'm most comfortable relying on rookies is wide receiver and safety, not as much the defensive line, where when it comes to this defensive line, 8 of the 12 players the Bills rostered last year are all expiring contracts. And we know that there's going to be a lot of new names and or a lot of new contracts when it comes to the Bills defensive line. But I think the curve is more steep for players to come in and make an impact on the defensive line. It just, for some guys, it just takes some time. Look at some examples like Ed Oliver and AJ Epinesa. Look at Justin Mattabuik with the Baltimore Ravens. Had a monster season this past year, but it's kind of a gradual build. And so if you want that quicker impact, I think the way to get it on the defensive line is probably through veterans. And you got to be a little bit more patient when it comes to the draft picks. Whereas I think wide receivers are coming in and producing right away. Safeties are coming in and producing right away. So that's how I would process this in terms of, all right, what needs do you fill in free agency? What do you fill in the draft? When you boil it down to the primary needs, I think fill the defensive line in free agency and then look to the draft for wide receiver and safety, where, like, candidly, those are deeper positions in this coming draft than the defensive line. And so that layers on top of it as well as a factor that I'm considering when answering that question. All right, folks, we got more to get to here in just a second here, including some thoughts on the Bills' cap position and how they got here and if it's a sign of bad management. So be sure to stick with us. This episode is brought to you by BetterHelp. Have you ever considered what you would do if you had an extra hour in your day? Would you exercise, read, spend time with family and friends, maybe catch up on some sleep? A lot of us spend our lives wishing we had more time. The question is, time for what? If time was unlimited, how would you use it? The best way to squeeze that special thing into your schedule is to know what's important to you, make it a priority. Therapy can help you find out what matters most to you so you can do more of it. Therapy is helpful for learning positive coping skills and how to set boundaries. It empowers you to be the best version of yourself. It's not just for people who have experienced major trauma. So if you're thinking of starting therapy, be sure to give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. All you do is fill out a brief questionnaire that'll get you matched with a licensed therapist. You can switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. So learn to make time for what makes you happy with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/lockedon today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedon. All right, folks, we got a few more to get to here today. The next one comes from Nate. Nate says, could you explain how a team gets into cap trouble like the Bills and many others have done? Is it because of bad contracts, and is it a sign of bad management? So the Bills are in a tight cap position, just like several other teams in the NFL and several other teams every year. I think it's just a product of having a really talented roster and players being expensive. I mean, that's what it comes down to. The Bills have drafted and developed a lot of very good football players. They've wanted to keep them, and you're trying to keep that core together, and you're trying to add around it, and over time, it just becomes very expensive. And teams are in this position quite a bit. Cap manipulation has become something that absolutely happens in the NFL. But to me, it's really a clear sign that you're a team that is all in, and you're trying to squeeze every dollar into players. And of course, I think every team has some bad contracts, and the Bills certainly do. I think you look at Von Miller, you look at Dawson Knox, you look at Trey White, and those are not good contracts for the Buffalo Bills. You know, those are bad values, and that doesn't help. But I think you can look at any team and come away with a couple of those. I think the problem is those are huge contracts. Von Miller, $20 million a season. Trey White, like $16 million a season. Dawson Knox, $14 million a season. Right? That's problematic. But I think more than having some bad contracts, which I think is common, right? Like I think that's important to acknowledge what's common and what's not. It just comes down to, like, you have a deep, talented team. You've drafted, developed, re-signed a lot of your talent, and it just gets tight, especially when you have some big dollar players like a Josh Allen, like a Steph Diggs. You're paying your left tackle and Deion Dawkins. Ed Oliver's expensive. Matt Milano's expensive, right? Like, there's just expensive players on this roster, and the Bills are trying to do everything that they can to keep the core together and try to win a Super Bowl. That's what it comes down to. And a lot of other teams in very similar positions. Look at the Chargers. Look at the Saints. Look at the Dolphins, right? They've been in these spots. They're in these spots right now, and that won't change. Next one comes from Joe, not me, but a different Joe. Joe says, in listening to the quarterback analysis you do each week during the season, and then did it on Josh in the season-ending recaps, I'm intrigued by the time to release stat. I'm curious what plays count or don't count in that metric. Obviously, balls the quarterback throws count, but what about RPOs, sacks, scrambles, etc.? Especially given how unique Josh is on some types of plays versus other quarterbacks. It got me thinking about what goes into the metric exactly. So literally every passing play goes into it. You snap the ball, you start the clock, and then whether it's a sack, when the ball is released, that time is calculated, and then you get an average across all plays. And I get these metrics courtesy of Pro Football Focus. I know that a lot of people take exception with their grades. I do too, but I don't take exception with their data. I think their data is terrific, and it's very useful in my analysis, and it's very consistent. I'm very comfortable with their process and how they come to their data. And NFL teams, all 32 NFL teams pay into six figures for their data. So I think it's good. So that's where I get it. That's how it's calculated. I do think Josh Allen is a unique player, and I think it's important to call that out. I think that was a good part of your question, Joe. And let me add some additional information here that I think even speaks to the uniqueness of Josh Allen. So one thing that's cool about Pro Football Focus and how they parse out their time to throw snaps is they will give it to you on all throws that Josh Allen or whatever quarterback gets the ball out in 2.5 seconds and under 2.5 seconds. Like, what is that average of all of those plays that they come out in under 2.5 seconds? And then what does it average out on all of the plays that are over 2.5 seconds? So when Josh gets it out in under 2.5 seconds, he averages 1.76 seconds, which is the second fastest trigger in the NFL. When Josh Allen is supposed to get the ball out quick, he gets it out quicker than literally anyone. You know who's number one, actually? You wouldn't expect it. It's Patrick Mahomes. So those guys, when it's a scheme throw, a screen, an RPO where they choose to pass it, they get the ball out extremely fast, like the fastest of any player in the NFL. Now, when Josh Allen holds the ball for longer than 2.5 seconds, his average time to throw is 3.86 seconds, which is the sixth highest in the NFL, right? So you can just kind of see the contrast. Hey, when it's schemed to get the ball out, it happens. When it's time to read it, kind of read through a progression and make a decision with the football, Josh will take his time, right? And so I think that's a good call out, Joe, in terms of how unique Josh is. And I think the contrast in those splits within the splits really do help tell that story. Next one here comes from Bobby, and it's a question about Bobby Babbich, so this is interesting. Bobby says, with Bobby Babbich being the son of a coach, of course, his son of Bob Babbich, was his dad ever a play caller where he can give Bobby some tips if he were to call plays for the Bills? Yeah, so Bob Babbich, the father of Bobby Babbich, the Bills' new defensive coordinator, does have experience as a play caller and had a really long career, both in the college ranks and in the NFL ranks. And he was the head coach at North Dakota State for several seasons. I don't actually know if he was the play caller there defensively or not, but he was the Bears defensive coordinator from 2007 through 2009. He was the Jaguars defensive coordinator from 2013 to 2015. So he does have play calling experience. And I'm sure that'll be a major asset to Bobby, right? I mean, we've all probably spent time picking our father's brains about things. I don't know if people have similar hobbies, similar lines of work as their dad. I grew up and my dad was a musician and a really, really good bass player. And I started to play music. And of course, I loved talking to my dad about how to play and learned a lot from him. And I know that that's a very different example than being an NFL defensive coordinator and play caller. But the point being, I think you're always going to have very good, candid conversations with your father. And I'm sure Bob and Bobby are doing that. And we'll do that. And they'll probably talk every week and be a good sounding board and an important piece of Bobby's development and, kind of stabilization as a defensive coordinator. Of course, Sean McDermott, a huge asset to him as well. Al Holcomb will be an asset on staff. But yeah, I'm sure Bob will be having some very good weekly conversations and conversations even right now about how to approach the job and how to call those plays. And obviously we're still waiting to find out if Bobby's going to call the plays or Sean McDermott, but Sean did comment on that at the combine and said, look, we'll make that decision when we need to. And so we'll see how it all comes together. And I'm sort of hopeful that it happens. I think it's I think if you're going to give somebody the coordination responsibilities, give them all of it. Unless there's just some type of fatal flaw where it's just not going to work out. But then I would hope that you were aware of that, given the years of time on task you have with him, to realize that that would be a stumbling block. So if it doesn't happen right away, I'm sure it will happen at some point. But I'm rooting for Bobby. Of course I am. I'm sure you are as well. But I hope that he's able to take on that play calling. And then if he does, I think that says so much, right? If McDermott's willing to relinquish it, like in this stage of this team, where, you know, we're getting anxious about the Super Bowl and all that, right? And we saw Sean McDermott take things into his own hands and be the defensive coordinator this past season. For him to hand that over to Bobby Babbich as a guy who's never done it, I think would say a lot about not only Sean's confidence in Bobby to do it, but what he's capable of, and would get me really excited. So there you have it, folks. A little commentary on Nyheim Hines, the combine and wide receivers, a couple segments of herd mentality. It's going to be a busy week here. One of my big plans this week is to do my mock offseason for the Buffalo Bills, which is always a ton of fun. So I'll be working on that all week, in addition to all the other things that we do here on this podcast. Bills conversation for you every single day, Monday through Friday. So don't miss anything. Make sure that you're subscribed. Would love it if you took a second to rate, review, and share the podcast. Have a great rest of your day. Go Bills. And I look forward to catching up with you again tomorrow.